Welcome everybody to the ISAS 2.0 webinar series on internationalization. This is the first webinar of a series that the International Association of Universities is launching today. My name is Giorgio Marinoni. I'm the manager for internationalization at the International Association of Universities, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce this session today. First of all, few words about ISAS 2.0. ISAS 2.0 is the IU program for advancing internationalization in higher education. It's a complex program that, as you can see in the slide, covers 3 services for the attention of higher education institution, individual working at higher education institution, and national organization and agencies. Today we are focusing on the service part for individuals. And actually, we are focusing on one of the 2 strengths of this service, which is the webinars. So webinars on specific topic on internationalization. And as you have received an invitation, is for the attention to both academic and administrative staff with responsibilities in internationalization. The ISAS 2.0 webinar are a series. And today's one is just the first one of the series. The series is intended to cover all the aspects of the internationalization process, from developing a strategy to monitoring and evaluating the strategy, and finally to achieve what is called comprehensive internationalization. The first webinar, the webinar of today, will deal with developing a strategic approach to internationalization. And it is intended to be a practical how-to tutorial. It's my pleasure to introduce you today's speakers, who are both IU Senior Fellows. The first one is Eva Agron-Polak. She was former IU Secretary General. And the second one is Madeleine Green, and she was former Vice President for International Initiative at the American Council of Education. Before passing the word to Eva, I will just mention that you probably have seen that you can write in the text box and you can ask questions. I kindly ask you to wait until the speaker will tell you that is the moment for question. We will have questions at the middle of the presentation and at the end. Thank you very much for being here, and now I will pass the floor to Eva.
Let me also welcome everyone to this first IAU webinar. As you can see, we have a number of goals that we would like to achieve in this first session. And some of them are pretty basic, and others I hope will be of much use to you. The first, we have to start with a little bit of a shared understanding of what is internationalization, or what it is that we're talking about. We'll talk a little bit about why it's important to take a strategic approach to the development of internationalization in any institution. We want to be practical, so we're going to suggest steps that are necessary, in our view, for reaching a successful development of or being successful in developing a strategy for internationalization. We'll look at how the process that you may wish to adopt, who the key actors that need to be brought on board are, some of the actions that you may wish to take, and hopefully the outcomes that you will reach. Part of this process is the undertaking of an asset map at your institution, and some details about what that may look like will also be offered. Most of us know what are elements of strategic plans, but perhaps in internationalization, you may wish to look at specific elements of such a strategy, and we'll make some suggestions as well. And finally, we will have a number of characteristics for what we would consider a successful process to reach a sound internationalization strategy. We hope that when you leave this webinar room, you will be armed with a number of things. The first one is arguments that you can use in your institution to develop an institutional strategy. There There is often reticence about developing such a plan, but we hope to give you some arguments that you can use to convince your colleagues. We will hopefully provide you with knowledge about those critical decisions that have to be taken and some of the milestones and actors that need to be on board, and outputs that must come together in order for the process to be successful. And I do insist on the notion of process. This is an important aspect of developing such a strategy. And we will offer an outline, and you will be able to take away an outline of a step-by-step outline of what the process may look like. So starting with what we mean in terms of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about internationalization. It's been described in various ways, but the most recent definition, which is now on your screen, is the one that I think IAU uses, and that is one of the more frequently used one. And the key elements in this definition are that internationalization is an intentional process. This is something institutions decide to do. It's not a reaction to an external stimuli. It's an intentional process. It is about integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into all aspects of higher education. The purpose, the functions, and the delivery of the teaching and learning and research. The reason why we do it is because we feel that it enhances the quality of education and research for all students and for all staff. And finally, it isn't only about the institution. It is also about making a meaningful contribution to society. So this relatively new definition encompasses all the most important elements of why and what and how we see internationalization. It's one definition among others, but it is the one that is most frequently used. In one university in Sweden, instead of having an elaborate definition, their strategy stated internationalization is not what we do, it is what we are. And I think that that's something that many institutions aspire to. So in that definition, you already saw that it has multiple dimensions. Internationalization is about changing curriculum, teaching and learning, teaching and changing how we teach. It is about various ways of offering programs and degrees like joint or dual or double degrees. Internationalization looks at campus life, the environment in which students learn and in which research is done and in which faculty is working. Of course, it's about recruitment and the international students. That's one of the most frequently cited aspects of internationalization, how many students we bring onto campus. Increasingly, it's also about outbound mobility. There is a huge emphasis now put on the fact that we also, in most institutions, need to send our students abroad so that they gain the experience we think is important in opening up to other parts of the world. International linkages, partnerships, development projects, development cooperation, they too form part of internationalization. Of course, research cooperation is a big part, often a separate kind of discussion, but it is part and parcel of internationalization. And of course, cross-border, transnational education, which includes a variety of modes, offshore campuses, offshore programs, online education, all of those are now important dimensions that may or may not all be present on your campus, but are possible and potential aspects of internationalization. I think this will be not unknown to you, but it's good to rehearse why internationalizing is important at the institution level. I think we're often asked to explain, and the most frequent answer comes with regard to students. It is about improving the academic quality of what we offer to our students, preparing students for a more globalized environment, more globalized world. It's about improving research through collaboration with institutions that may be have complementary interests or capacities. It's about building capacity, institutional capacity, or offering specialized knowledge such as area studies, languages, and of course in a more and more diverse society, which we are experiencing in many parts of the world, it's about increasing cultural sensitivity of everyone, students, staff, faculty. Internationalization also contributes to the greater good because it creates experts who can address societal problems from diverse perspectives, including international perspectives. It, through development cooperation, can build capacity in partner institutions, in partner countries, but also, of course, at home through collaboration. And increasingly, internationalization is expected and can address global challenges and global problems which don't stop at anyone's borders and which have an impact locally just about everywhere. For many institutions, and especially leaders of institutions, internationalization is also about prestige, profile, and of course rising in the ever-present institutional rankings, whether they're national or international. Last but not least, especially in places and countries where tuition fees form a major part of university financing, revenue generation is a big part of internationalization. It's also one of the reasons why we need to understand it more fully so that we see it as a much more complex and comprehensive process, not only one that looks at revenue generation. Of course, internationalization takes place in a very quickly changing context on every level, changing context nationally, globally, but also institutionally. And so looking at developing a strategy for internationalization, we must consider the specific institutional context in which the university or higher education institution exists. Look at the mission and the history of the university, the language. Of course, English being more or less the lingua franca internationally, the institutions that are not operating or have instruction in English as a first language have a set of challenges that others do not have. We need to look at who our students are. Are they mostly part-time students? Are they full-time young students? Are we a public university or are we a private institution? All of that determines how we will look at internationalization. Of course, the tradition of creating strategic plans is not a very old one in many universities. So having already an experience in strategic planning is something to look at. And is there an institutional strategic plan more generally into which or to which the internationalization strategy can contribute is a major question. Some of you may already have an internationalization strategy, so you have to look at why you would be writing or developing a new one, taking stock of where the current strategy has taken you and what needs to change to move forward. Who's involved and who's responsible for internationalization is part of the context. Is this an institutional institution where a decentralized approach is prevalent? So doing an institution-wide strategy may meet some resistance, or is this a highly centralized institution where everything is expected to come from the center? Those are important aspects to think about. As we will talk about the mapping of assets, knowing whether you have data available to you and whether key information is readily available becomes important, because you need to start by taking stock. And you need to also understand that the international office may not be the only one involved or engaged in internationalization. You may want to know and consider how other departments, faculties, but also the counseling office, admission office, other parts of the university are already engaged in internationalization. So those were the institutional issues of context. At the national level, there are also important dimensions to consider. Some of you may come from countries where there's only a handful of universities. Others come from countries where there are a large number of highly diverse higher education institutions. So the size and the structure of the system may determine your particular niche, your institutional niche, including in internationalization. You may need to consider the current political, economic, and societal climate. Is this a good time to promote internationalization in the sense of the political culture? Is there a pushback to having migrants in the country? Is there a pushback to having more international students? Or is this a time where people come together to say this is an area that we need to build? Economically, if you're seeing, especially in public institutions, severe cuts to funding, is internationalization going to be seen as the way to generate revenue, and how will that impact your strategy? And of course, the societal climate has a lot to do with the political climate, and you may need to consider where in the country you're located, the population in which, or the local communities, and how they will welcome a more internationally oriented institution. Many countries, both in Europe, but not only in Europe, have developed full internationalization strategies at the national level, set targets, chosen priority countries or regions, including areas in which they feel their country has a good opportunity to work more internationally. Those national strategies are, of course, important for you to consider as well. They set the context, and they usually come with, hopefully they come with funding supports, with new schemes, and you need to be aware of those, of course. The visa regime in any given country is an essential, if not a controllable, aspect, but it needs to be kept in mind, particularly if the visa regime is specific to certain parts of the world. And of course, the employment rules that will dictate how welcome and how long your international faculty and international students can stay in your country, those all have an impact on your considerations of a internationalization strategy. Globally, there are also trends that you may wish to consider, and in any case, these trends are, I think, quite visible, and even if they may not impact on you directly, I think they are playing an important role in higher education. One of these is that internationalization has become so important in most institutions, and so developing a strategy may be expected. and welcome at this stage. The reason I think that internationalization of higher education has moved so much to the center is because there are expectations that it will help bring about competitiveness. It is an instrument of the national soft diplomacy interests. It is a way of building capacity. So it has become important because of its utilitarian aspects, if you will. It's a major commercial activity for many, and for many institutions it's an indicator of quality. If you're not fully engaged internationally, you're no longer considered part of the mainstream of quality institutions. In each context, these expectations may differ, but they are growing. And there is, because it's become so important, a lot more attention paid to outcomes and impacts of internationalization. So monitoring becomes important. So why develop a strategy? I think you've probably heard some of that already in what I've just said. But one of the main reasons to develop a strategy would be that you can design a coordinated response to all these external changes and external demands. An institutionally coordinated response, I think, is important and can be extremely useful. If the process is done in an interactive and collaborative way, you should reach a shared understanding of where you want to go. What is the desired future for your university? If it is a collective and consultative process, you will gain buy-in. The process of developing strategy will bring many stakeholders into the discussion, into the conversation, and get a buy-in and embed the process more into their day-to-day work. One of the key reasons to develop a strategy is because facing multiple demands, a strategy helps you make choices. The prioritization is always difficult, but if you have a strategy, then you can make choices among a variety of competing priorities more easily. And again, as I said already, the emphasis on impact on an assessment with a strategy will be made somewhat easier. Finally, and this is the last slide from me, and then we can take some questions. We believe that having a strategy will improve the quality of what you do. It makes it possible to cross-pollinize efforts within an institution. It makes it possible to learn from one another. Many institutions do still operate in somewhat of a silo approach, but knowing what your colleagues are doing in terms of research in other departments, what your colleagues may be interested in particular country, can bring more efficiency and improve the quality of all your activities. Aligning resources, both human and financial, with the goals of the strategy is a very important reason to develop such a strategy. Knowing where you want to go, you can create other policies that will enhance that process. You will or can reach an agreement on when you have reached success, and therefore you can reward when those that have achieved success, but you can also find ways to redress areas that aren't as successful and identify additional ways to pursue goals that may be more difficult. So all of these are, I think, important reasons to develop a strategy in an ever more complicated and complex and demanding context at every level. And I think that probably the next part of our presentation, which really focuses on the how-to, will also help you do that. So I will stop here and open up the questions before passing the microphone to Madeline Green. And I think you have to write your questions so that we can see them in the chat box. I see someone writing, so we will wait a couple of minutes before Madeline Green will start. Well, I don't see any questions, so perhaps... Oh, sorry. Just a sec. Is there... Yeah.
This is Madeline. I'm
see just seeing them now.
Some faculties...
So how is the best way to write a strategy, starting with the directors and presidency, or better with the other bodies? I think our next speaker will provide some answers to that question. So if you can be a little patient, you will be able to hear, and if we don't answer you, you'll come back to it at the end of our presentation. What is the most important strategy that developing countries should improve in their territory? Well, it's a very important question, but it's very contextual in the sense that developing countries' universities have a specific focus, developmental focus, at the same time as being teaching and learning and research institutions. And so the strategy should be aligned with the role and the mission they're playing locally, first and foremost, while at the same time, through international collaboration, being connected to other institutions and part of the higher education international community. But I think it's very important that in developing countries, the starting point is the national or local goals they have and mission that they have set for themselves, rather than, in my view, looking at the global landscape. They are, I think, first and foremost addressing the needs in their national development context. Professor Guven is asking whether there are additional resources for creating. Well, there are a number of internationalization strategies that are available, and there are IAU is providing one of the services to assist and provide feedback on internationalization strategies through the ISAS process. So I would recommend that you contact Giorgio Marinoni after the seminar to really look at what the ISAS program can offer to your question. Yep, please do.
Eva, I think I'm going to jump in here so we can move on and we can get back. I would also add there is a literature about internationalization. I would look on the IAU website. It has very good references. I would look at the publications of the European Association of International Education. I would look at the Handbook of Internationalization, which is also on the IAU website. There's quite a literature on this, and I'd start for directions with the IAU website. So now I would like to turn to some of the more operational aspects of developing an institutional strategy for internationalization. So the process really includes two phases. The first phase, which you might consider a preparatory phase, starts with the decision to develop a strategy and continues through the process of mapping your current international activities and assets. And we're calling this an asset map or an internationalization review. And then sharing that map with the larger institutional community. The second phase I will return to later in the presentation, and that's the actual development of the strategy. So the first bullet on this slide points to a crucial foundation for moving ahead. Without the support from top leadership, a mapping exercise or the development of an internationalization strategy will be seen as the work of the international office rather than that of the institution. So the idea may very well come from the international office, but it must have genuine support from the administrative leadership. We will return to the second bullet, the formation of the leadership group. That is the group that creates the asset map. It's a very important group, and its composition is important to represent different parts and functions within the institutions. The group decides, once it's formed, how it will conduct its work, and then it goes about creating a picture of what is going on in internationalization at the institution, or the asset map. But it's not just a map, it's also an analytical tool, and it addresses the following questions. What are we doing in various aspects of internationalization? That's the map. What is working well? What is not? Where are the strengths and gaps? So the most important question then is, what does the information tell us? And this mapping exercise can take from 4 months to an academic year. So what's the rationale for doing this? Well, knowing what is going on at the institution and how well it is working is a key foundation on which to develop a plan. Information is often scattered around the institution, and no one really has a complete picture. So the mapping helps make visible all that's going on around the institution, and just to see the scope of these activities comes as a surprise to many people on campus. So you can see the internationalization activities or the lack thereof, and you can see how it aligns with the institution's overall strategic plan and goals. For example, if research is an institutional priority, but the asset map reveals a low level of internationalization, international collaboration in research, that's useful information for the development of the internationalization plan. Also, having information and data helps ground the decisions in facts rather than opinions or politics, and will lead to a more rational and defensible internationalization strategy. I want to underline in the third bullet the possibilities for synergy. Eva mentioned the silos. In many institutions, internationalization activities coexist alongside each other, but don't necessarily interact or support each other. So some institutions, when they've done the exercise, have created geographical interest groups when they saw the different players across the university engaged in a particular region or country, but who had never been in contact with each other. And finally, the process of conducting the asset mapping should engage the leadership group in conversations across the institution, providing people an opportunity to reflect on how their own work contributes or could contribute to internationalization. So now we turn to the group that actually conducts the work. And there are different approaches depending on the institution. Some institutions had larger committees of around 20 people because they needed to represent many faculties and units. Others had committees of 10 to 14, which is often an easier size group to manage. So a lot depends on your institutional context. Your committee should have people who are respected on campus, teaching and administrative staff, students, all who have an interest in internationalization. The international office should play a supporting role, since the work is about the institution, not the international office. Most institutions have a respected member of the teaching staff as chair. Some choose to have a staff member from the international office as co-chair. Other institutions, the staff member was the secretary or the coordinator of the group. So in creating an asset map, there are two key decisions at the outset. First is about scope. Will it cover the entire institution or selected faculties or schools? Although we suggest the former, it is possible to conduct the asset mapping and development of an internationalization plan for a single school or faculty, especially in very large and decentralized institutions. But we suggest the institutional focus to reinforce the idea that internationalization is an institutional commitment and part of an institutional strategy. The second decision is about timetable and how you will work together. What is the target completion date? It's important not to rush. Are there milestones along the way? What will the work schedule look like? Who will do the work? Will there be subcommittees, the division of labor? So all that needs to be discussed up front. Next, we need to think about the information you need to gather. What do you need to know and what is nice to know? Those are two different things. What information is readily available, existing in the international office, other parts of the university, such as the faculties or the institutional research office. So it's important to think about what you can get your hands on fairly easily. Some institutions have also tried conducting surveys of faculty and staff with mixed success. You'll need to think about whether your institution suffers from survey fatigue and what's the likelihood of their actually completing a survey. Sometimes it's more effective to have conversations with faculty and staff at their regular meetings, such as department meetings or dean's meetings, or one-on-one conversations. So there are multiple ways to gather information. Communication along the way will be crucial to gaining acceptance of the report of the asset mapping and eventually of the international and the internationalization plan. So the leadership group needs to develop a communications plan early on in the process, addressing such questions as who needs to be kept informed, how, who should be consulted, what's the mechanism, meetings, web, something else, Where can you give regular updates? Should you create a web page to collect and display information? Then we turn to the question of what will you map? And this slide is very similar to Eva's on the aspects or dimensions of internationalization. The language is a bit different. There are many different dimensions. You can go more or less deeply into them. Looking at the first bullet on institutional commitment, we suggest that you start with institutional documents, such as the institutional strategic plan or unit or faculty plans, to see how and where the commitment to internationalization has been articulated, if it has. I want to skip to the fourth bullet to focus on curriculum. Mapping the curriculum can be a huge undertaking. So the question is, how deeply can you delve for the asset mapping exercise? The least complicated approach is to inventory programs with an international or global focus, language and literature programs and courses focusing on particular regions, courses and programs taught in a foreign language. A more nuanced and complicated approach is to have academic departments examine their curricula, observing the extent to which individual courses develop students' knowledge of international and global issues or achieve specific international and global learning outcomes. And for that, they will have had to have an articulation prior to the mapping exercise of the desired learning outcomes associated with internationalization. Although it is unlikely that institutions will take such an in-depth approach as part of the asset mapping, they might realize through the mapping process that they really don't know a lot about the extent to which students are actually engaging in global learning in the classroom, and they therefore may decide to pursue internationalization of the curriculum as part of the international plan. On the bullet, engagement with institutions in other countries, I would point out that many institutions find that they need to address two issues. One is the number of agreements that exist on paper but are not active and what to do about them. And the second issue is how accessible and visible the information on agreements is. Is there a database? Is it kept in the faculties? Is it kept centrally? How well is the tracking mechanism working? I'm going to conclude this slide by saying most institutions find in the mapping exercise that they have significant gaps in the information they have at hand. Identifying what you do not have and how you would use the data if you could get it is an important part of the mapping exercise. So let's return to the overall process, move towards the development of the internationalization strategy. After the completion of the asset map, the report should be widely disseminated and discussed, and that's the bridge between the two phases. And again, you need a decision to move ahead, but one would hope that that is an affirmation of a decision made up front to conduct both phases, the asset mapping and the development of a plan. So once the decision to move forward is affirmed, the next decision is about the composition of the group that will draft the plan. This could be done by the same group that did the mapping exercise, or a different group, or a mixture. It's helpful to bring in new people to get new viewpoints and energy, but it is also useful to retain some members for their familiarity and historical memory. So the drafting group uses the analysis of the information gathered to set goals and define concrete steps. And as was the case in the first phase, it's very important that this group consult widely, circulate drafts, solicit input, and think about the alignment of this strategy with the institutional strategic plan. And once all this work has been done, the plan generally goes to the appropriate individuals and groups for formal approval, such as the academic senate. An internationalization strategy does look somewhat like an institutional plan or strategy. It should guide the efforts of the faculties and the units in their development of an internationalization plan for the unit. They often begin with a vision statement that serves as a guide and an inspiration. Next, we look at some overarching goals that can translate into specific directions. And you have an example here on the slide of increasing the number of international students. Outlining specific actions or strategies, especially who is responsible, what are the measures of success, will ensure that the implementation of the plan is clearly charted. Monitoring and evaluation are particularly important to know if your goals are being met. If not, why not? Plans may need to be revised for a number of reasons. For example, if there are budget cuts or goals that were originally set were off base or too ambitious. So a plan is a living document that gets reviewed at least annually and refreshed as necessary. So I want to conclude with some observations about what makes for a successful effort, both in terms of the process and the product. First, consider the process. A leadership group would do well to design a process for its work at the outset. Who needs to be involved, timetable, etc., that we talked about. This is an important investment of time upfront to avoid mistakes along the way. Achieving broad support, as I noted, involves committed leadership from the top, providing legitimacy, helping to integrate change into the overall institutional strategy, and helping to secure or provide the necessary resources. Good process is commitment from the top, but is also bottom up to get grassroots support from the faculty and staff who will be affected by the changes brought by internationalization. I think I've emphasized engagement, collaboration, communication. I'd simply say that institutional efforts that fail often do so not because the ideas aren't compelling, but because the process was not carefully designed. So I'm watching the time here. The second element of success is a solid internationalization plan. Process is only a part of the story. You need a good product. What they look like will vary from one institution to another in terms of formats, levels of specificity, and emphasis. A plan must be at the same time ambitious and realistic. You need sufficient human resources to carry it out, clear and measurable goals, effective monitoring where you pay attention to failures, but be sure to advertise and celebrate successes. Finally, it is also worth emphasizing that the practices of a university must support what it says it values. So, for example, if internationalization, if it's a value, institutions should seek out teaching staff with international experience, interests from abroad, and internationalization should count in the reward system. So, to sum up, a successful plan is the result of an effective process and a solid product. The goal is to have internationalization embedded in the culture of an institution, be part of its identity and aspirations, and to have widespread interest and engagement to ensure that internationalization is both broad and deep. So I thank you, and now we'll look at some of the questions. If you'd like to start typing. I see there was a question about the role of consortia in universities and internationalization. Consortia can be helpful in several ways. They can share resources. They can have cross-registration in academic programs. They can join forces in developing new programs, in working together to provide programs for faculty and staff about internationalization, especially if they are close together. They can compare strategies if they are not competitors. They can form all kinds of linkages for mutual support. So I will wait a few minutes for you to type in your questions, and hope, since we started 5 minutes late, perhaps we can go over 3 or 4 minutes over beyond the appointed hour.
There was an earlier question about funding for, if I understood it correctly, funding for the development of the strategy. And I think that this is something of always asked, something that many in many institutions people ask. Most frequently, this is an in-house, an investment of time that is required from faculty and the staff in the international office to take on, because it's an investment in a process that will strengthen the institution. It's quite rare that you would need a lot of money. You do need time if it were to be an interactive and consultative process. But I think you can always resist the request for money to do the development of a strategy, unless you take on an external consultant or a body to assist and a group to assist you. But in the institution, I think most people would be quite happy to spend some time if at the end there is a strategy that brings everyone together.
There is a question about starting with proper human resources or some other resources, and support from the top or the bottom. I'll start with the second one. It's always a kind of iterative process. I think it's important to start with support from the top, that developing an institutional strategy is important for the institution. So if the leaders of the institutions don't see this as important and don't see this as furthering the institutional goals of improving teaching and research, then I think the strategy is very different than doing an asset mapping and a strategy. Then it is more business as usual of just trying to work with different individuals and faculties. So, but as I said, you also do need support from the grassroots, and most institutions have a group of enthusiasts that can carry a process, but they need to be very scrupulous about reaching out and not just having the most enthusiastic carry the whole responsibility, but have them serve as kind of ambassadors for the process within their own departments and units and faculties. Starting with the proper human resources, I'm not sure what you mean there, so perhaps you could clarify that question.
I was just going to comment to say that if you do not have support from the leadership, the strategic plan won't be adopted in the kind of way that you want it to be adopted. I think if the support is coming from the leadership, then there will be some commitment to deliver on it. So that's a very important reason for having a decision at one point from the leadership. But then the process, as Madeline has said, needs to be broadly based. I think in terms of proper human resources, I think you answered it, Madeline, by saying that it's good to have people who are enthusiasts and who know this area and who are already involved. But it would also be very important to bring in the skeptics, the people who are perhaps not directly involved in international activities, people who are involved with students, a broad spectrum of individuals across the institution that can contribute and perhaps have not been asked to contribute in the past. To me, that's an important part of bringing new stakeholders and new interests to understand what the process is about and why it may be important.
I'm looking at Professor Guven's question. Is there a platform where international officers can compare and discuss internationalization strategies? I can think of several resources. First is IAU, which has a meeting about internationalization on a regular basis and draws chief international officers as well as others on campus interested in internationalization. There are regional organizations such as the European Association for International Education. There's an American one, the Association for International Education Administrators, that draws people from around the world at its annual meeting. There is NAFSA, which also draws people from around the world. There are national organizations for internationalization depending on the country. So there are a number of places, meetings. There are also webinars like this one held by various organizations that I just mentioned.
And I think Professor Guven is from India, and the Asia Pacific Association for International Education may be of interest as well, because they have grown substantially and bring together the international education staff and leaders from mostly Asia and Pacific, but not only as well. APAI is the acronym for that organization.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva and Madeline. I think we can move to the conclusion of the webinar if there are no more questions. But before ending, I would like to thank you very much all the participants for having spent 1 hour today with us, for having been so active and posing questions. And I can tell you that the webinar is not ending here, in the sense that you will be able to access the presentation and you can download the presentation from this platform. And the International Association of Universities is always there to help you in case you want to know more about how to develop an internationalization strategy. I invite you to visit our website, and especially the pages on internationalization. And myself, personally, I'm always available. You can contact me. You can find my contact email on the last slide. And last but not the least, as I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is just the first one of a series of webinars that are dealing with internationalization strategies. So please follow IU, and you will receive information when the second webinar about how to monitor activities in internationalization and how to evaluate a strategy will take place. You will receive an invitation for that one. So once more, thank you very much for being here. It has been a pleasure. I would like to thank you very much the speakers of today. I think they did a great job, so I would like to thank Eva Grompola and Madeline Green. And last but not the least, you have not seen her, but I would also like to thank you, Ekaterina Minaeva, who was supporting us technically and helped you with the connection and replying to all your technical problems. Thank you all, and hope to see you soon at the next ISAS 2.0.
Giorgio, as well.